Well, hello and thank you very much for watching today's talk, which is part of the virtual laboratory Cognitive Approaches to L2 Instruction, Bridging Theory, Research and Practice. My name's Richard Pinner, and I'll be talking to you today about metacognition and I'm going too fast for myself. I'm going to be talking to you today about authenticity and metacognition in L2 learning. And I'd like to thank Maria Bodarenko and Vita Kogan for inviting me to give this talk to you today. Just a little bit of an introduction for anyone who isn't familiar with me. I work in Japan at a university in Tokyo called Sophia University. And I have a PhD from the University of Warwick, and I've written a few articles and two books about authenticity. My main focus with authenticity is its relationship to motivation, and hence I approach authenticity really from both a social and psychological perspective. And this was why I was invited to give the talk today about metacognition, because metacognition is a very important way for me that authenticity bridges into motivation. So a lot of the classroom practices that I do and a lot of the research that I do involve metacognition in some way, usually in the form of reflection, with students being asked to do reflective work or doing reflective practice as a teacher researcher, and that kind of thing. So that's really my background and my interest. I also approach authenticity very much from the perspective of English as a global language, and hence I try to talk about issues to do with prejudices and discrimination against non-native speakers or people who are perceived as non-native speakers and that kind of thing. Also, I have a small child and a big dog, and I'm just throwing that in there so that there's a bit of authenticity right from the start. Okay, so today's talk, as I've given a brief introduction about myself and my position, so what I'd like to do is quickly give you an overview of what I'll be talking about in today's talk. First of all, I'll be problematizing authenticity and explaining why there's such inherent difficulty in defining authenticity. And I'll then try to provide a definition of authenticity after having problematized it. And the definition will therefore be quite, hopefully, a rather flexible but thus quite broad definition. So it's not a hard and fast definition. And I'll also then move on to the discussion of metacognition and authenticity, which I already briefly touched upon when I explained that that for me it's really a bridge for how authenticity connects with motivation. When I'm talking about that, I'll also mention autonomy as well, because autonomy and motivation, there's a strong link between those two, and I think authenticity and autonomy and motivation are strongly connected, and they come together in a triad, which I call the language impetus triad, which I'll be talking about in a moment. And then I'll talk about students and teachers and how they might utilize metacognitive strategies in order to create a culture of authenticity in the language classroom, and then there'll be a conclusion and a summary. For the question and answers, I'll have to stick that on later as a separate video, and also, because this is an asynchronous video, because I'm recording here in Japan, I should have been in the UK working as a visiting lecturer at the University of Leeds, but COVID saw to that, and also is the reason why I have this hair. for the questions, you can email me. I'll put my email on the final slide. I also have a website, uniliterate.com, and uniliterate is my Twitter handle, so you can use Twitter to contact me as well. So please use any of those mediums to use follow-up questions. Right, so let's start with a definition. Let's go all the way back to ancient Greece. Authenticity comes from the word authenteo, which meant to have full power. It's made of two parts. The word auto means self, and hentes refers to the doer or being. So you can probably see already that there's an etymological link with the word autonomy as well. So authenticity and autonomy are rather similar concepts and have similar etymological roots. The auto in both words refers to self. Autonomy is being able to do what you want to do, and authenticity is knowing what you want to do in some ways. So you're authentic if you're kind of true to yourself, or you do what you think is right, and or you're autonomous if you have the power to do that. So there's a link there. Now, the word authenticity, it seems like a fairly simple word. It's a commonly used word. It's a familiar word to language teachers, but it's also familiar in many other fields. One type of authenticity is sometimes referred to as artifact authenticity, and that refers to the kind of things that people who work in art galleries, or for example someone who collects Swiss watches. So in my case, I'm very interested in watches, so I wanted to use this example. If you've already seen my plenary talk video from the FAPI conference in Argentina, you may have already seen this little routine, so I apologize if I'm repeating the same material. But can you tell which of these watches is the authentic watch? And of course, to the trained eye, it's obvious that the watch on the left with the dark black bezel, and that is the authentic one. You can tell because the numbers are finer. There's more detail on the watch strap. If you took a closer look, you'd be able to see, for example, the one on the right here now with the red arrow. This is the fake one. It's kind of blotchy. It's not quite as finely well crafted as the authentic one. So that means that if you've got something authentic, then the opposite is something fake. So authenticity refers to real or genuineness, and that's true for many applications of the word, and it's how we kind of approach authenticity and how we understand it. However, it's not always as simple as that. So this is a photograph of Dr. Mueldoko, who was the former Indonesian National Armed Forces commander, and he was in power between 1981 to 2015. So he had a long, illustrious career, and yet he had to resign, all because the authenticity question was raised about his own watch. What could have happened to make him have to resign over a watch? Well, basically, many people in Indonesia, many Indonesians are living in poverty. And although he's a very high-ranking official, he's actually still technically a civil servant. And he was seen wearing a watch that costs in the region of $100,000. So people asked him, "Why are you wearing such an expensive watch? How can you afford this expensive watch, mate?" And he said, "Oh, it's a fake. Here." And he took it off in the middle of a press conference and threw it on the floor and said, "Would I do that if it was a fake, if it was a real watch?" So the question of whether his watch was authentic or not became a national scandal, because if it's real, that probably means, or possibly means, that he's been taking bribes, he's been accepting money from somewhere else. He shouldn't really be able to afford that watch, the people thought. And yet if it isn't a fake, then he was being true. No, if it isn't a fake, he is a fake. If it is a fake, he was true, but it didn't matter because nothing was ever fully proved. It was just a question of authenticity was enough to make him decide to resign. Another example would be these two famous paintings. So can you tell which is the authentic Mona Lisa? Obviously it's the one on the right. That one is by Leonardo da Vinci and is currently hanging in the Louvre Museum. Maybe some of you have been to see it. It's very small, isn't it? However, this one is also an authentic piece of art because it's by Marcel Duchamp, even though it's basically just a postcard of the Mona Lisa that Duchamp drew a pencil mustache onto. It's still a work of art and it's still worth a lot of money in itself. So you can't just say that one is the authentic Mona Lisa and one is not authentic art. It's not the authentic Mona Lisa, but it is an authentic piece of art. And this is further complicated by the fact that there are various versions of the same piece. So Duchamp drew lots of mustaches on lots of postcards of Mona Lisa, and so there are various versions of it. So which of those is the authentic one? Same problem with Damien Hirst's famous shark, which is titled "The Physical Impossibility of Death in the Mind of Someone Living." And the first one that he did was with a real tiger shark in formaldehyde, and he didn't know how to properly preserve the shark, and he didn't do it right, and the shark ended up looking like this, all rotten. Oh, Damien. But someone had already spent millions buying that piece of work. So then what he did was Damien Hirst made another shark that was properly preserved and didn't go rotten. But which is the authentic one? The first one, the original one, or the one that didn't go rotten? It's a good question. This is a philosophical issue, sometimes referred to as the ship of Theseus problem. So the ship of Theseus was first talked about by Plutarch, and it's a question that has concerned many philosophers since those times. Basically, it's based on the idea that the ship that Theseus sailed on was preserved in the docks in Athens, and they replaced every single plank of wood as they went rotten in order to keep it preserved. And eventually, after some time, nearly every piece of wood on the ship had been replaced. So it was asked, is this still the same ship? Same could be said of these two photos as well. So they've got Shakespeare's globe, which was rebuilt in order to give modern audiences a authentic experience of watching a Shakespeare play as it would have been performed in his day. On the right is a photograph of Toyama Castle, and lots of Japanese old buildings were bombed in the Second World War and rebuilt. So are they the same? Are they the same castle if they are built anew? It looks the same, it's basically the same, but all the pieces are new. The question of authenticity is also an interesting one because people can't always tell what's authentic. So there's a famous story that Charlie Chaplin once entered a Charlie Chaplin lookalike contest and only came in third. But this is actually an urban myth. There's no evidence that he ever actually entered a contest. It's sort of hearsay, and there are other stories that say he did enter but he only came in 25th place. But actually it's the whole story is probably apocryphal. So that's another example, and that's why we have wonderful quotes like this one from Abraham Lincoln warning us not to believe everything we read on the internet just because there's a picture with a quote next to it. So anyway, what is authenticity in language teaching and learning? This is the main point of today's lecture. I've basically given a tinned overview of the complexities of the question of authenticity, but how does it relate to our work as language teachers and language learners? So, for those of you already familiar with the authenticity literature, you'll probably know Alex Gilmore's paper from 2007, which was published in the journal Language Teaching, in which he looked at a huge range of literature spanning about 100 years and identified 8 different overlapping definitions of authenticity. I've simplified them somewhat. And as you can see, there's definitions like the native definition, which obviously is problematic, and so therefore people started to use the real definition, which I also will argue shortly is problematic. So in the real definition, that refers to language that is produced for a real purpose, a real communicative purpose, as in not for language teaching. But that is problematic because that means that if you create something for language teaching, it's therefore never going to be authentic, which means that anything you do in the language classroom more or less is not authentic or can't be authentic because it's done for language teaching. So that I find that problematic because I want my classroom to be an authentic learning environment. There's the self-definition, which is kind of philosophical in nature, referring to be true to yourself kind of thing. There's the classroom definition, which draws on the work of, for example, Leo van Leer, and so on. Task authenticity. There's the social aspect of authenticity. There's a special definition which is specifically used when talking about language assessments. For those of you with some background in language assessment, you'll know that authenticity has its own specific meaning there, which is connected to the target language use domain. And then there's the cultural definition, which is about integrating with a culture, which is again problematic because many people who learn a foreign language might not be doing so in order to actually go and live in that country, especially if you're learning a language which is a lingua franca such as English. Most of the people who learn English are not intending to go and live in countries where English is the main spoken language, so not everyone wants to integrate into the culture just because they're learning a language. But language and culture are obviously inseparable in some ways, so lots of complexity there. A very, very interesting book and a very, very good introduction to the authenticity debate is this one by Leo Will, who did a discourse analysis of the way people talk about authenticity, and he's in particular since the rise of communicative language teaching, and he has identified a taxonomy in which he's got textual authenticity, authenticity of text reception, real world authenticity, classroom authenticity, authenticity of individual behavior, and cultural authenticity. And this is very, very scholarly work where he's actually analysed the discourse on authenticity, and it's a very in-depth literature review. So I would definitely go to that if you would like to learn a bit more about how people talk about authenticity. For my point, so it's getting a bit complicated probably by now, the whole authenticity thing. I think I've established it's not simple. In fact, most of the time when you define something, it's with authenticity, it's easier to say what is not authentic than it is to say what is authentic. It's actually easier to define authenticity ex negativo than it is to say, oh, this is authentic. So to try and sort of simplify it, I think that you can separate the way people talk about authenticity in language teaching into two basic strands. You've got the kind of existential strand, which focuses on interactions and it's quite philosophical. And then you've got the practical strand, which tends to focus on materials and text and that kind of thing, and its emphasis is really on teaching. And I think there's a misconception that these two strands cannot go together because one is too complicated and one is too simple. And I think that actually that's the problem. We need to bring these two strands together if we're going to keep the term authenticity as a useful term in our field. So this is where I'll move on to a little bit of my own research. What I did In 2016, I published a paper where I turned Alex Gilmore's 8 definitions into a questionnaire, which I administered to a small group of teachers and students that I was working with here in Japan. So Japanese students at a university and teachers who work in Japanese high schools who are Japanese teachers of English. And looking at Gilmore's definitions and asking them to grade them, 5 strongly agree, 1 strongly disagree, 3 don't know. And as you can see, there was a lot of division between the native definition. So students agreed with that, but teachers, teachers are the light colour on the screen. The teachers didn't like that, but they didn't strongly disagree on average, which I found interesting. The teachers liked the real definition, and the students were, just agreed with that. Where was also interesting is the classroom. So students thought classroom was a good definition, but teachers didn't know. Whereas students didn't know about the task definition, whereas teachers liked that one. Okay, so that was a very small scale research. But one of the problems that I found in all the small scale research that I've been doing, and also in the wider analysis of the term of authenticity that I've found, is the problem of the native speaker and the mythological status of this native speaker doesn't really help in the fact that people are sort of gravitating towards native speakers when they think about authenticity. Even if you're talking about the real definition, it will tend to be a real material from a country where they speak English, which would therefore be, tend to be, because it was more easily to access, for example, the BBC or CNN or whatever. Those are more easily accessible and more widely recognized than, for example, a Singaporean English language newspaper. So there's a gravitation towards this kind of native speaker idea with authenticity. It's inherently in there, and this is why I've made links between authenticity and native speakerism, which is quite rampant around the world, but in Japan it's quite strong, and you see adverts like this everywhere. Which of these people is the teacher? Obviously it's the white male, and because he's probably a native speaker. And this is a big problem. This is something that you can see everywhere. So this is a photo that I took near the station where I catch the train to go to work. There's a private language school called Nova, which I actually used to work for that company. And they're advertising their school on the window there by saying all instructors are native speakers, as if that's enough to make you want to go there and get a lesson. Now, Donald Trump is a native speaker, but that doesn't mean that he'll be a good teacher. In fact, he can barely speak English properly. He's terrible, and he's not the kind of person I would want to learn English from, but he's a native speaker. So is it enough to be a native speaker? I don't think that is a qualification for teaching, but it's sold as if it is. This is all happening despite the fact that over 20 years ago, David Graddol and many others before him, for example, the Katru Quirk debate and that sort of thing, have been arguing that native speakers may feel the language belongs to them, but it will be those who speak English as a second or foreign language who will determine its world future. And I've had issues where I've been writing papers for journals and talked about the problems of authenticity and native speakerism, and people have said, oh, but native speakerism isn't such a big problem anymore. We've been talking about it since the 80s. But in academic discourse, we're very, very careful about how we talk about native speakers, and we're aware that it's a problematic term and that kind of thing. However, the problem hasn't gone away at all, because on the ground where the teaching is done and where lessons are sold and where students are coming to classes, native speakerism is still rampant, as you can see from this image. So this was a bit of research done by one of my students for his graduation thesis that I supervised. Suguru Saito found that this company called AGOX, which is a private language school here in Japan that sells online lessons, they are charging more if you want a lesson with a native speaker, and if you want a cheaper lesson you can just get a Filipino teacher. And as you can see, it's 100 points for 25 minutes with a native speaker, but only 20 points if you want a Filipino English speaker. This is really, really prejudiced and horrible. Why is a Filipino person paid less than a person who can call themselves a native speaker? And what is a native speaker anyway? You know, it's a very problematic concept. I did a bit of research with my students again, showing videos. This was a few years ago, before Donald Trump was president, we had good old Barack Obama when I did this research. And what's very interesting about this is I basically asked the students to watch a video of the speaker and then to say how authentic the speaker was. And what I found was rather a large discrepancy between those for whom English is a second language and those for whom English is a first language. Many of the students believed that Arnold Schwarzenegger was a native speaker. Now, not to say that he isn't. You could view Arnold Schwarzenegger as a native speaker. However, he was born in Austria and he has a strong, he has an Austrian English accent. So he might be classed as someone who's learned English, and yet they couldn't tell that he has the Austrian accent. They thought he was a native speaker just because he lives in the US and he's a famous actor and governator. So I think that sort of slightly altered the average of that graph there. But what it suggests to me is that a lot of students, and possibly it's beyond that as well, but have a sort of negative image of those who have learned English. And Peter Medgies talks about self-discrimination, where people who learn English are harsher on the mistakes made by other learners, whereas if a native speaker makes a mistake, nobody really cares. But if a learner of English or someone who's learned English makes a perceived grammatical mistake, then they tend to be harder on them. So this is a problem, and so this is partly to do with the perceived social capital of the native speaker. So when I talk to students here in Japan, often people will say to me, I want to sound like a native speaker. Or if we talk about motivational goals, a lot of my students want to sound like a native speaker, want to have a British or American accent usually. I've heard a few people say they want to have an Australian accent as well, but no one's ever said I want to have a Japanese accent when I speak English. And there's a sort of this hierarchy of speakers and prestige varieties of English, and that's very much part of the authenticity issue, and not to be ignored and not to be whitewashed over, because it's a problem and it's part of discrimination. So we need, as teachers, we need to make our students aware that that could be a form of discrimination. Robert Lowe and myself have a paper called Finding the Connections Between Native Speakerism and Authenticity, which goes into this issue in quite a lot of detail. But anyway, all these problems have led me to the conclusion, the rather unfortunate conclusion, that all Englishes are equal, but sadly some varieties are more equal than others. you might recognise that I have slightly altered George Orwell's quote there for my own purposes. I'm quite proud of that. Anyway, authenticity, basically, to wrap up this whole little section, authenticity can be considered to be the degree... Oh, hell, I just skipped that. I'll be coming back to that slide anyway in a moment, but authenticity can be seen to be the degree of congruence between actions and belief. Anyway, so let's move on now to materials and authenticity, because one of the reasons that authenticity is a big issue in language teaching is because it tends to be used to talk about materials. When you ask somebody, what do you think of when you think of authentic materials, rather often they'll say, oh, newspapers and that kind of thing. And this is another example of one of the problematic aspects of the real definition and how it tends to conflate with the native definition of authenticity. I don't really like talking about authentic materials, to be honest. We don't talk about autonomous materials. We talk about materials that can facilitate autonomy. We talk about materials that can foster autonomy. We talk about autonomy training, that kind of thing. But we don't talk about autonomous materials in and of themselves, like it's some inherent trait. However, we do with authenticity. We say authentic materials all the time. But I think that authentic materials have the same issues that autonomous materials would. Authenticity is not an inherent trait of the materials. It's something that needs to be brought out. And in my research and in my writings, I talk about creating a culture of authenticity, and I talk about trying to achieve something called social authentication, and we'll be discussing that in a moment. But anyway, as I said, a lot of the classic definitions, the traditional definitions, tend to rely on this idea that authentic materials or authenticity, it refers to something that is not developed for pedagogical purposes. Could be a newspaper or magazine from a English or from a target language speaking country, and that will tend to come from a perceived sort of center variety of the language, and then you've got all these hierarchical issues going along with it. So I think we need to move away from this real definition, and I find that definition rather classic. So not to say that it doesn't have a place in history, but just we can't really drive it around anymore and use it to get us where we need to go. It's very likely to break down under regular use. So for materials, this definition by Tomlinson and Masuhara I find very useful. They say that authentic materials are designed not to transmit declarative knowledge about the target language, but rather to provide an experience of the language in use. And I find that very, very convincing. My attempt to define authenticity led me to formulate something called the authenticity continuum, which was my attempt to approach the job of defining authenticity not from one perspective or not in one way, but actually to consider different contextual and social aspects when we're trying to talk about authentic materials or when we're discussing authenticity. So when you're considering the authenticity of a material, it might be helpful to think of it in terms of how authentic is it in terms of the target language use domain, where you're going to be using the language, where will the learners actually speak the language. And they probably will be more than one location, so they might be using it at a business conference, or they might be using it in a personal socializing situation. That brings me to the community aspect. So who is the speech community that they will most likely be using the target language with, and how do those people speak? If it's a young person who wants to make friends, they'll need to know all kinds of memes and internet language and that kind of thing in order to understand how to communicate. They'll have to have a lot of digital literacy as well, because a lot of the communication they do will be online. But if it's a business person, or if it's someone who's just planning to travel for tourism, then their needs will be very different, and they won't need the nuances of internet slang to be able to order food in a restaurant. Then you've got the learning context, because each place where we teach and learn has its own requirements for assessments to reach the requirements of national curriculums, in order to not get shouted at by the parents or the government. Teachers have to do certain things with their students and get them to a certain level. And so we need things that are authentic to those requirements as well. And finally, then you've got the individual level of authenticity. How much are the students going to buy into this material? How much are they going to be able to personalize it? How much of it is about themselves, or is relevant to themselves, or is interesting to themselves? So please see my book for a further detailed discussion of the authenticity continuum. But I'm going to move on now, because I think I've been talking nearly half the lecture just about authenticity, and I haven't really talked about metacognition yet. So again, I ask the question, what does this have to do with English language teaching? Like, when we're actually on the ground in the classroom teaching a class, where's authenticity fitting in? So metacognition for me is an important aspect of authenticity, as I said at the start of the video, because it helps to bridge the issue of authenticity and motivation, which was my main research interest, and that's what I did my doctoral research on. I'm going to talk about metacognition from the perspective of students and from the perspective of teachers. And most of the strategies that I'll talk about are very similar. They basically involve reflection in some ways. So another just final aspect is that in order to bridge authenticity and motivation, I think that the term autonomy is also important, because those three concepts form a triadic relationship, which I refer to as the language impetus triad, simply because I think if as I said when I talked about autonomy and authenticity having close etymological roots, authenticity is your beliefs and knowing what you think is the right way to do something, and autonomy is having the power to be able to do it. And it's well established that autonomy and motivation are connected. You're not going to be so motivated if you don't have autonomy, but then you're not going to be autonomous if you don't have motivation. And I think authenticity also fits in with that relationship. If you don't have authenticity, you won't be motivated, and so on. So you need to have a sense of authenticity in order to feel motivated, and in order to have authenticity, you need to be motivated to have it. So they need to be thought of as a dynamic relationship that is, it's a difficult thing to forge in the classroom. This is the slide that I skipped earlier. I said it would come back, and here it is. So Vanini and Burgess say that the authenticity is the degree of congruence between one's actions and one's core self-conceptions, consisting of fundamental values, beliefs, and identities. And I thought that was excellent, and that really rings true with me. I think that what we've got here is a very interesting link between authenticity and motivation, as I said, because you're much more likely to do something if you believe in it. So for very useful reading about motivation and metacognition, please see Emma Ushioda's work, Motivation, Autonomy and Metacognition, which for me also has a lot of authenticity in it as well. Another interesting concept, which I'll come to when I start talking about energy return on investment, is the work of Phil Hiver on language teacher immunity. And I'll come back to that in a moment, but I just wanted to bring that up now so that I can refer to it later. Okay, so with my work on metacognition and motivation and authenticity, what I've found was that where most of my research ended up focusing was on this issue of self-assessment. So for students, if you're trying to get them to be more motivated, to have more autonomy, more authenticity, I found one of the most successful ways in my own teaching was to require them to do self-assessment. I'd already started doing this just from a practitioner point of view, but then I started to get a research interest in it, and I found that the work of John Hattie and his Visible Learning series was very convincing in providing evidence for the fact that self-assessments and reflection are very, very good in creating effective learning. So John Hattie's research looks at effect sizes of various different things that teachers do by conducting a meta study or an analysis of meta-analyses, actually. So it's a huge, the breadth of it's absolutely huge, and he found that self-assessment was one of the highest impacting factors that influences learning. So I was onto a good thing with my self-assessment, I decided. So I kept going with it. What I do when I'm teaching classes here in Japan is because I'm allowed to set the assessment criteria, I set it like this: attendance 10%, so they just need to show up and they get 10% for that. Class participation, that's worth 30% because this particular example is a speaking focused class, and then they get 60% for individual and group presentations, so that's the sort of final assessments. This class participation one, though, this is obviously going on throughout the semester. How am I going to assess all my students' class participation? Am I going to keep notes on every single one of them for each class that they participate in? I didn't think that was feasible, so I decided that I would just ask the students themselves to give themselves the grade for class participation and do it as self-assessment. And at first my students found this to be very novel. They'd not done much like this before. And what we did was I elicited from them responses to the question, what makes a good participator? I asked them to think about what's a good participator. So this is sort of encouraging a bit of reflection, a bit of metacognition. And then together they worked in groups, and then we put all the groups' answers together, and then I kind of synthesized them into a questionnaire, which I then handed back to my students. And how it works is they get 30% of the semester for self-assessment for class participation. I give them a questionnaire that has 10 items, 3 times in the semester, like each third of the semester. So they do. So each question is basically worth 1% of their grade. Each time is worth 10%, and altogether it's worth 30% of their grade. And they just grade themselves out of 5 originally, but now I made it out of 10, so it's even easier for them to see what grade they're giving themselves. I gave a talk about my self-assessment research in Hong Kong quite a few years ago now, and one of the participants who was from Saudi Arabia and was a teacher there, put his hand up for questions and said straight away, "Oh, I don't think this would work with my students. They would all just give themselves 100%. How can you trust that your students are actually being honest?" And a lot of people were nodding as well and saying, yes, my students would just give themselves 100%. And I don't think that's true. I think if you gave your students a shot, wherever they are in the world, I'm pretty sure that if you set it up properly, you could get reliable results. However, the research on self-assessment is rather inconclusive about how reliable it can be. People tend to overestimate their abilities, and also what I've found here in Japan is that people often mark themselves too lowly if they're good students and too highly if they're not good students. So it does require a bit of feedback from the teacher, and they have to know that you're actually looking at these results, and if you disagree with them you have to do something about them. So you can't just completely give it to them and let them run with it, I think. The first paper that I wrote about self-assessment was actually talking about a problem that I'd had with one of my students who had marked himself much too highly for what I thought, and he was the first person to ever do it, and I didn't know how to deal with it. So that was in this paper, Trouble in Paradise. So I wrote about this student who had given himself too high a grade. And then another one that came from a synthesis of the work I'd done was published in the Asian Journal of Applied Linguistics, and that has more data about how self-assessment affects my students' motivations. And basically, by encouraging them to look back on their work, I found that it helped them to maintain their motivation. Motivation tends to sag around the middle of the semester. I'm pretty sure most of you have experienced this, and I found that doing self-assessment, having some kind of reflection, allowed students to reset their goals, to remind themselves where they were here, to kind of re-energize them. So that aspect, that kind of metacognitive aspect of self-reflection, self-assessment, I've found very, very useful in creating a motivating classroom dynamic. And because you're giving feedback and because you're doing it together as a class, it creates a culture of authenticity as well. It's part of the process of what I refer to as social authentication. Speaking of this concept of social authentication, this is what I'll just discuss now as we move towards the end of the video. Which would you find more motivating? Materials from a course book or materials you have created yourself? I'm talking to as teachers now. I think most people would agree that things that they've created themselves are more motivating. A teacher's motivation is extremely important in the language classroom for maintaining students' motivations, because, as DC et al. Have said, the relationship between student and teacher motivation can either be positively or negatively synergistic. Once again, I've got it 3 times after all. Once again, to go back to authenticity as the degree of congruence between one's actions and beliefs. When we're being authentic, we're acting on our beliefs. We're doing what we think is right. So in terms of language teaching, if you are teaching in the way you believe is the best way to teach, then you can say that is authentic teaching. So unfortunately, it's not always possible, because sometimes you are forced to teach certain things. You have other forces applying political influence in your teaching. You've got the national curriculum, you've got certain guidelines, you've got standards and assessments that you need to reach. So you might not agree with those things, but you still have to teach to them. So that's why you might not always be able to do what you really believe is right when you're teaching, and students will probably feel the same as well. What they think is the best way to learn might not necessarily be the way that they are taught. So authenticity is when you actually achieve this sense of congruence. Now, this sense of congruence is very important for motivation, because authenticity can be considered a master motive for social interactions. So we're seeking authenticity all the time. It's what motivates us to to talk to people. It's what motivates us when we are being ourselves, when we create our identities, when we negotiate our identities. We're seeking authenticity, authentic connections. So as you can see, it's very linked with motivation. And now when I talk about authenticity, or when I talk about motivation, I'm basically talking about the same thing in many ways, because there's a strong theoretical link between authenticity and motivation. And in the language classroom, what we're seeking is what I refer to as social authentication, which is when you've got back to this positively or negatively synergistic idea, you've got convergence when teachers' motivation and students' motivation are working together. So that would create a situation of social authentication, where the students' goals and the teacher's goals are aligned. The students working on what the teacher has asked them to do, the teacher and the students both believe this is a good way to be learning, this is what we want to be doing, and it becomes a very motivating and social authenticated classroom situation. And if you've ever had a class like that, I'm sure you'll know what I'm talking about, and you'll probably know that that's one of the reasons that keeps teachers in the job. Those happy moments where everyone's convergent, and I call that social authentication. However, you do get situations where there's divergence, where the students' goals are not aligned with the teacher's goals. The students are not listening to the teacher, or the teacher is demotivated, and then that can actually affect the students' motivations, or the students are the ones who are demotivated and the teacher comes in all energized and leaves the class feeling like they've lost a load of energy or spent a load of energy and got none back. So this was really what my doctoral research focused on, motivational synergy. And this is the book that I published you can download the PDF of my thesis for free, or you can spend a lot of money on this book. It is a slightly expanded version of the thesis, but maybe your library has this, but please do refer to it if you would like a much more detailed description of this phenomena. So, as I said, there's a strong theoretical link between authenticity and motivation. And what I came to view authenticity very simply as in the language classroom was either as a kind of a gap when you've got this divergence and there's no authenticity holding you together, or authenticity as a bridge where you've got this convergence, and often the materials that you're using or the tasks that you're doing can form that bridge between students and teachers, but other things as well are important to keep the bridge strong, such as feedback, such as doing lots of things that help us to reflect on our learning, metacognitive strategies, so that we know why we're there. If you don't know why you're in the classroom, you can't possibly be authentic, because you won't know what your beliefs or your values are for that particular class. So one of the first things necessary for creating a culture of authenticity and to get that convergence is to get students to reflect on why they're there. And as a teacher as well, you'll need to do that yourself, to reflect on why you're a teacher, what's your philosophy of education, what do you believe is the best way to teach, and make sure that you're doing it to as much a degree as you possibly can. However, when you create this bridge, this convergence, this social authentication in your classroom, beware, because not all bridges are as strong as they look, and there might be crocodiles underneath. That's why I've got the Indiana Jones picture there. If you haven't seen the Temple of Doom, you probably don't know what I'm talking about now. If you haven't seen the Temple of Doom, why are you watching this video? Anyway, essentially, I think that we can ask the question, do you get back what you put in? So if a teacher has all these ideas about authenticity and motivation, you've read widely on the subject as I have, and then you go into the classroom and you just think, right, if I put in a lot of energy, if I do what I think is authentic, then it should be returned by the students. And that would be nice, but it doesn't always work in theory, I think. So my research looks at the dynamic link between students and teachers' motivations, and I came up with a concept called ERI, or energy return on investment. Basically, energy return on investment is a term taken from physics and ecology, often used to explain the efficiency of fuels. So basically, energy is defined as the ability to do work, and ERI is the payback that you receive from that work. So how much energy you put in, how much energy do you get back? In terms of teaching, I apply energy return on investment to refer to the amount of energy a teacher invests in the class and how much energy or work is returned by the students. And this is why I mentioned Phil Hiver's research on language teacher immunity before, because there's a fair bit of overlap between those concepts. So energy, I hypothesize that energy return on investment is a way that social authentication is forged. If there's a high congruence between teacher and learners in terms of social authentication, this creates a close synergy and reciprocal, mutually beneficial energy flow. So in other words, if you go into a class and you put in a lot of energy and you get a lot of energy back, you're going to keep on putting in energy into that class, and you're going to be aware of it, because as a teacher, you'll be collecting feedback from the students. You'll be looking at their faces, you'll be looking at how much work they've done for the homework, if they're late, if they're on time. Many different indicators will show you as a teacher if your students are paying attention to you, if they're working hard, if they're enjoying the class. I think teachers are fairly tuned into their own classes, and they can tell how much the students are giving back. At other times, unresponsive learners mean that a teacher will naturally reduce the amount of energy they expend on a class, which in turn has a knock-on effect on motivation as well. Not only the teachers, this process might not actually be conscious. This might be below consciousness. We might not be fully aware that this is happening. You might just think, "Oh God, I don't want to teach that class." You might not have realised that this is energy return on investment. So this is why I think metacognition is very important for teachers' motivation, and that of course then has a feedback with the students' motivation as well. So by doing reflection and by looking at your own teaching, questioning your own beliefs, and then working with students to create this culture of authenticity and working towards social authentication, you can avoid classes that look like this. We've got students falling asleep at the back. Don't get enough sleep here in Japan. I've been there too. I've had students falling asleep in my class, even though I try to be very dynamic. But if you invest a lot of energy, and if the students return that investment, these clips come from the film Dead Poets Society. I don't know if you've seen that film, but I like the image of the students returning the feedback to the teacher, showing their mutual support. So in order to do that, the students have to kind of like you personally as well. So there's a lot of things going on in the language classroom. Okay, so in conclusion, I've talked about how authenticity is a problematic term, how it tends to gravitate towards native speaker varieties, and how it's very, very difficult to avoid that because of the hierarchy of authenticity, the social capital associated with prestige varieties of English. And these are political issues around the concept of authenticity within language teaching, which we need to be aware of. I've been mainly talking about English language teaching because that's what I focus on. I'm aware that you're not all English language teachers. You might be language teachers. You might teach many other languages. So I think it applies to all language teaching. But especially with English, because English is taught so widely around the world. But you know, with Japanese, for example, I learned Japanese, and there's only one country where Japanese is spoken, so naturally that will also prioritize Japanese varieties. And then within Japan, you've got the same problem. The Tokyo variety is considered to be very prestigious, and other country varieties less so. So you get these issues with all language teaching, but you know, of course, it's just on a larger scale with English. So that's a problem because it leads to discrimination. So I think making students aware of that and being aware of it ourselves when we talk about authenticity is the first step. Then I talked about social and psychological factors to do with authenticity in language teaching. Especially I identified why I link authenticity and motivation together so much, because basically they're a connected concept. There's a strong theoretical link between the concepts, and one way to create this wonderful idealized version of congruence, where you get social authentication, where you've got students and teachers working together, motivating each other authentically, working together authentically. One of the ways you achieve that is by helping them to facilitate metacognitive strategies, reflection, self-assessment, teachers being aware of their own values and beliefs, and making sure that they communicate those values to the students as well, and involve them in the process of their teaching. So always looking back at why we're here, what are we going to do next, what do you want to do, what's the best way to do it, trying to involve the learners and the teachers together in a mutual process of validification. Okay, so I think that's the end of the video. I actually recorded this video yesterday, and the video was, my lips were out of sync with what I was saying. So I hope that that hasn't happened this time, and I hope that the video works okay. I apologize for all the roadworks and noise that's happening outside my house. They're building some houses nearby, of course, and they started as soon as I turned on the video. And I apologize for sneezing, and I apologize for the delivery as well. I hope I can edit those out effectively. Now, if you would like to continue this discussion, or if you would like to contact me and talk about authenticity and motivation, or have any other questions related to that, then please do get in touch with me. You can go to my website, uniliterate.com, and I'll put all the slides and other links up on there for you. You can also contact me through Twitter. My handle is @uniliterate, and you can just email me at my normal university email address at sophia.acjp, and I will be happy to hear from you. Once again, I'd like to say thank you to everyone who watched this video. If you made it all the way through to the end without falling asleep, and if you learned something, that's fantastic. If it was a bit too fast or a bit too complicated, then you can just watch the video again, or you can email me. And I wanted to say a big thank you again to Maria and to Vita for inviting me to join you for today's virtual laboratory. Thank you very much indeed, and keep it real. Thanks.